Welcome to the She, He, We Awakening podcast. We are a wife and husband therapy team whose professional and personal lives are centered on psychology and spirituality.
We love sharing what we've learned on our journey of becoming conscious through relationship, and we invite you to get to know us and hopefully hear in our stories something that can support you in your life too.
Hello, my love. We
Hello.
meet again after so long.
It has been a while.
It has been a while. Yes.
Yeah. Today we're going to continue our conversation about neurodivergent brains, autism, ADHD, and coping strategies for having a slightly different brain. Where are you with this now? It's been several weeks.
I have come to embrace it, I think, more since our first podcast and of course all of the conversations we've had and the sharing. I think as a framework it makes a lot of sense. I still have I would hesitate to even call them reservations. It's more like caveats. I would say I still see a lot of temptation, I suppose you could say, in terms of people potentially falling into these definitions and these narrow containers and allowing it to define their lives and sort of dictate how people feel about themselves. But of course, that's true of really any container. It's true of grand spiritual containers. You know, we did a whole podcast on spiritualized ego. We've talked about that over the course of a couple podcasts, actually. So, you know, it doesn't make it it's no worse than any other conventional way of describing the psyche or our experience of being human. We just have to make sure that we have the conversations and take it with a grain of salt. And as with all things, I think take what's useful, and, you know, the old Bruce Lee philosophy, take what's useful and discard the rest. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure we'll get more into where I am with this as we go through this second set of discussions about it.
Yes. So I think part of what we want to cover today is some of the overlap of these traits. Mm-hmm. And especially how autism and or ADHD overlaps with PTSD, because I think that's probably one of the biggest issues with accepting or rejecting a diagnosis, is that a lot of times we don't know, you know, we have this pattern, this way of being. We don't know if it's from some kind of trauma that we had, or if it's actually an inherent part of our nervous system and we had it all along.
Yep.
It's very, very hard personally to do that. And clinically, it's very hard also to be able to determine that.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning that like so many things in life, the debate about nature versus nurture is present here. And that's really what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I think I've seen a lot more of this coming up since we did the first podcast on this. And since it's been in the forefront of our conversations, I've seen a lot of it coming up with clients, where having this conversation about nature versus nurture has proven to be really helpful for people in their own process. And I'll just share my approach to this very, very briefly, because I think it relates directly to how I approach this conversation. So when you're talking about these particular diagnoses or descriptions of symptoms or nervous systems or way of functioning, et cetera, right? There's two possibilities. We look at this, as you just said, as, well, this is something that's innate with us, innate within us. It's something that we were born with, or that was conditioned so early that we might as well have been born with it. It's simply a part of the fabric of who we are, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be describing it as being in our nature, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's, well, how much of this is habitual? How much of this is learned traits that I can unlearn? How much of this is trauma informed? How much of this do I have the power to change, right? By conscious effort, by shadow work, by self-exploration, by practice, et cetera, et cetera. And that would be the nurture side of the equation. And so the conversations I've been having with people a lot lately on this, I just remind people that if the question of nature versus nurture is coming up, the answer is always that it's both. Always. It's never just one or the other. There's a paradox, there's a dialectic tension between the two. These are two polarities, just like Puer and Senex, which we've talked a lot about, which we'll talk maybe more about today. And we can't escape either side, nor should we. It's two sides of the same coin. The experience of being human is this mystical, inexplicable, paradoxical, impossible to define sort of alchemical mixture of nature and nurture. And our process is about exploring that within ourselves and coming to answers that are helpful for us with respect to, well, do I want to orient more towards the nature aspect of what's going on here, or do I want to orient more towards the nurture aspect of what's going on here? So I guess my caveat up front is, as I've sat with this, this is a long-winded answer to your first question, which is, where am I with this now? Where I am with this is that as long as we honor this tension between nature and nurture with respect to ADHD, autism, etc., then I'm all in. I think it's fair game, and it needs to be, well, it doesn't need to be explored. It's useful to explore it, as long as we hold that duality in consciousness as we do the exploration.
I love that you put it this way, nature versus nurture. That gives me a really great framework for understanding, because, if you take ADHD, for instance, it seems like most people look at it as a nature problem. Like, this is how my brain is, and so I'm going to treat it purely as a nature problem,
right,
and give myself drugs and cope in that way. And yet they suffer still because they haven't maybe explored fully the nurture side. Maybe they haven't done some of their healing work around the trauma of being perceived as different or being treated as different,
right,
which increases stress, and stress increases dysregulation and will increase symptoms. And yet there are also people who perhaps have not seen themselves through the lens of ADHD, and therefore are looking at a constellation of issues in their psyche and only working with the nurture aspect.
Yep.
And they're either rejecting or unaware of the nature aspect, and therefore frustrated and struggling continuously in their life because they're not honoring the fact that their brain has needs that are different than the average person's needs.
Right.
So that's a good framework.
Yeah. I think that, that's the point, is that if people are just oriented towards one side of the coin only, that they're missing a lot of important information. And when we do that, it's not just information, we're missing half of the truth. And if we're missing half of the truth, we're missing opportunity to exercise authority in our own lives, right? So nature versus nurture, using two different words, it's exactly the same tension. If we say, instead of nature, we say biology, and instead of nurture, we say psychology, right? So nature versus nurture is the same thing as, well, is it biological or is it psychological?
Right.
Is it wired in my body and in my DNA, or is it something that lives in my mind? And of course, I would ultimately argue that that's a false dichotomy, false narrative. But we won't get into heavy duty non-dual teaching at this point. But nonetheless, we can work with that and say, well, whatever the truth is, certainly the experience of being human is that there seems to be stuff that's more biologically oriented, and there seems to be stuff that's more readily explainable through psychological terms. And so that's what this exploration for me has become since we started having these conversations. And what I think the exploration can be, and should be, I think, for people, if I can be assertive by using the should word there.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah. So I think for me, for example, I have, well, for most of my life, as people who have been watching this know, I wasn't able to do a lot of introspection, or I didn't have the tools for that. And I had no exposure to therapy, and I journaled a little, but it wasn't a very effective tool for me because I wasn't reading it over and processing it. It's just blabbing out a bunch of feelings. But when I started doing therapy, it was heavily focused on the nurture aspect, on the psychology piece. And so I kind of tore apart my life and my persona, basically trying to understand every little pattern, every thought process, why I was seeing the world the way I was. And I analyzed it through this lens of PTSD, this lens of trauma. And at some point I had to stop doing that because I ran out of material. There was nothing left I evaluated and processed and examined all the aspects of my life, and I wasn't getting anything out of that process. And it took me a while to go from that place to where I am now, where I recognize, okay, I've done all the clearing around this thing, all the analysis around this thing. I still don't understand why I am this way, because you'd think after processing it, it would be fine, like it would be done. It's still present. What else could this be? And have shifted into the biology piece, which for me is more of an autistic presentation. It's more of the hypersensitivity, overstimulation, stimming, having difficulty with language at times, difficulty understanding people, not having this innate sense of how things work that other people have, struggling with a feeling of belonging and feeling safe, and more of like an anxious profile, essentially.
Right.
And because I now have that other side of the coin to look at, all of the searching, I guess, it's not like I'm done figuring myself out or knowing about myself, but it's a whole different lens. And this is an area where I can actually apply a lot of coping strategies for things that I have not found coping strategies for through a psychological perspective. So I'm really glad to find the biology aspect and to be able to have that lens.
Yeah. I mean, as you describe that, what I hear, and it does also resonate with my experience of this to a degree as well, is that if we've only explored the psychology or the nurture side of the coin, then sort of wrapped up in that is this energy of, this is about me and my shortcomings or my trauma or just things that are wrong. things that are wrong that I quote should be able to fix somehow, or that people tell me can be fixed. And so if we're only looking at the nurture and psychology side of this, then almost by definition, we're seeing it as a problem that should be fixed and can be fixed. Right. And what you're describing is that, you've made a life of exploring that side of things, right? We both have, and you've been doing that for a long, long time. And you recognized that at some point, there was nothing else there to see. You've mapped out all the shadows. It doesn't mean we're perfect, but we know the landscape of the shadow self, and we work with it and we honor it. And there are things that still just haven't changed or don't
Mhm.
change, right? And so we turn the coin over and go, oh, okay. Well, maybe this isn't about something I'm doing wrong or something that's broken within my psyche or deficient or even a problem, so to speak, that needs to be fixed. It's just something more innate. It's something that's more nature, something that's more
Mhm.
biology. And there's a whole different energy that comes up when we look at it from that side, right? And say, well, if this is just the way that I'm wired, well, what am I going to do about that? Right? How do I respond to this in a way that's productive and loving and helpful, knowing that there are certain elements of this that are just always going to be true,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm just always going to be in a male body.
Mhm.
And I don't want to get into debates. I'm certainly willing to honor that debate, but I'm just trying to use an analogy here, something that's typically understood to be more black and white and less malleable,
Sure.
right? I'm in the body of a man, and that's just my nature. That's just my biology. And so I have to really learn to work with that, right? And
Mm.
find a way to sort of honor that and live my life in a way that's consistent with the truth of that. If I'm super invested, and so here's a good example, because even honoring the debate about gender and the fact that we now have medicine and science that allows for gender transition and all of that, if I'm invested in having a child, like literally physically giving birth, I'm just going to run into a wall. It's not going to happen. Right. And if I'm looking at that from this nurture psychology side of the equation, wanting to find out, well, why can't I should be able to. What's wrong with me that I can't? How do I fix this, et cetera, then I'm just going to be bumping into that wall for the rest of my life. I have to turn this over and look at the biology, the nature side of this, and go, oh, it's to use a word, it's not in my destiny.
Yeah.
Right. My experience of being human will not and cannot include the experience of carrying a developing human being in my body and giving birth. It's not going to happen. Right. And there's a totally different way of working with that reality when I honor that biology side of things.
That's very true. And so as you were thinking of this gender example, I was thinking of the same thing. For a lot of my life, I even had resistance around this. And it was very difficult for me to accept that I was a woman, that I was in a woman's body and was subject to all of the experiences that women have, including, having periods and having to be the one to give birth. And having to be the one that is most of the time physically weaker and more at risk for harm. And so I worked with that psychologically, and fortunately, I think that has mostly settled in my psyche. But
Yeah.
I don't know, because I have yet to go through menopause, and I'm sure that's going to bring up things to think about and explore and be at peace with. But if I accept that I'm biologically a woman, and I mean this not kind of, I mean this for me, like I am a biological woman, and I choose to be a biological woman. I'm not interested in transitioning. I'm going to have to accept and become conscious of everything that entails from a nature perspective, and work with those things. So I'm a woman. I have to know that for some period of my time, I'm going to menstruate. And at some point, I'm going to stop menstruating, and my hormones are going to change. And that's going to have some effects on my body. And I need to be mindful of that and taking care of myself in new ways that I'm not used to. That's just the natural evolution of a woman's body. And so much like that, if you are looking at something like autism comes with a variety of traits that are disabling to people. And I'm becoming more and more willing to say that word, disabled, because I'm lucky that I live the life that I have. I'm lucky that I have the kind of partner that I have, the family that I have. I'm lucky that I was raised in the way that I was, which mostly allowed me to be who I am and to express myself physically however I needed to express. But the truth is, every day I still struggle with things that other people do not, that the majority of people do not. Let me put it that way. Everybody has struggles that other people don't have, but I have more struggles than the majority of people from a physical perspective, from a biological perspective. So I have to accept those traits and become aware and conscious of those and learn how to take care of my body because of the things that I have.
Right. Yeah. So having to honor the nature side of the coin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then with respect to the nature versus nurture, biology versus psychology, we have to look at these labels, ADHD and autism, from both sides within ourselves is, I think, the idea that we're trying to convey here. And so to that end, you've got some stuff that you want to share, right?
I do. And I also want to say, the research shows that, and it's hard because there's a lot of research, but anywhere between 30% and 80% of people who have one of these conditions, if you want to call them that, will have both. So it's very few people who only have autism or only have ADHD. Most people have a constellation of symptoms that is including both. And this excludes people who, or it attempts to exclude people who are experiencing these symptoms because of trauma.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let me share my screen. And I first want to look at, I want to explain a little bit more about the autism spectrum in general. And the reason why is that most people think of the autism spectrum as a line where you have on one end of the line, you have a little autistic, and on the other end, you have very autistic. And other words for that are high functioning autism, which would be low, a little autistic, or low functioning autism, which would be, high, very autistic. And that is not correct. That's not how the autism spectrum actually works. It's more like a wheel, which you can see in this image, where there are these different characteristics, like interoception. The word interoception means seeing from within or sensing within. And so people with autism have difficulty recognizing when they're thirsty or hungry, or recognizing when they're full, or having the ability to be aware that they're feeling stressed. You can have a lot of problems with interoception, for example, but you can have not a lot of problems with stims, which is on the left side of the image. Stims are a way that people move their bodies to regulate their energy. So things like hand flapping, like this is the classic one. And people have a name for this. They call it happy hands or happy arms.
Okay.
And you see lots of kids doing this. It's just a common one. Other ones are like picking at cuticles, pulling hair, pulling eyebrows, picking at skin, picking at your face. Those are all stims. They're repetitive, self-soothing behaviors. So someone could not stim very much, but could really not be able to know when they're full or know when they're thirsty. And they could have a mix of things in this whole wheel. And every person with autism, and I would argue with ADHD as well, is probably going to have a mix of these different symptoms. And so nobody looks like they're on one end of the spectrum or the other. It's some kind of, I forget what that's called, but it's like the little spider web looking thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like a spider web than a line.
Yeah.
Because you can be, and here's one of the difficult things too, with the high functioning and low functioning thing. You can be considered a high functioning autistic person, which means you are capable of working. You're capable of meeting people and navigating the workforce, and you can even have a relationship. But you can be very low functioning in other areas. Like you could have a very hard time knowing when you're hungry or thirsty, and actually need someone to help you cook or make sure that you drink. Like you can be totally dependent on someone else in one of these areas for care, or else you have medical conditions as a result, basically. So high functioning and low functioning is not even as clean as that. You can have high needs in one area and low needs in another, and it's kind of a mixed bag depending on your presentation.
Right.
In all of these categories, I can hide my difficulty very easily. I can sit very still, for instance. If I need to, I can sit perfectly still. I can absolutely not mask or not stim, but other people do not have the capability of doing that. And we've all seen kids who just can't sit still. And you ask them to sit still, and like 2 seconds later, they're moving. Like some people just don't have the capability. And therefore, they're going to have more disability when it comes to things like you're sitting in a meeting and everyone expects you to sit still, and you are at risk for losing your job because you can't sit still, or you're doing something that someone finds socially awkward or off-putting.
Right.
So anyway, here's the autism spectrum, and it's I think it's good for everybody to even be aware of what these different terms mean. So take time, and if you want to, and look them up. I wanted to show you the overlap between PTSD and autism. So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you look at PTSD alone, there has to be a presence of a traumatic event, obviously, or events. You'll often see avoidance behaviors, so intrusive flashbacks and memories, and nightmares. This comes from PTSD. Most people with autism without PTSD are not having flashbacks or nightmares. That's not a part of their experience. Solely autistic people are going to do those repetitive behaviors and using routines and stimming. That's what they're talking about. Repetitive behaviors like stimming, like flicking your fingers and things like that. People who are autistic alone without PTSD are going to have a hard time reading social cues. So you could be for example, here's an example of a social cue. You and I are having a conversation and you look away. And your focus is somewhere else. Someone with autism who hasn't figured it out is going to keep talking. And they'll just keep talking even if you're walking away. Because they're not reading the cue. Or they don't care, but it's mostly because they're not reading it. People with autism are going to have sensory sensitivities always throughout the life, not from after a car accident or after being abused. It's going to be, their parents are going to say, oh, they were always kind of sensitive and fussy. Also, people with autism have special interests. These are areas of expertise where they dive into something and they're going to know everything about that thing, or they're going to research it until they feel some kind of sense of satisfaction. That's not going to happen with PTSD. That's atypical. But you can see in this image, there's all these things in the middle that are common to both. Dissociation, Dissociation means you're just checked out. You're not really present. Your sensation of your body is decreased, and your awareness is either inside or somewhere not with your body. People with these two conditions can have trouble with intimacy. One is because there's trauma. The other is because they have trouble understanding and reading social cues and being in relationships and expressing themselves. There can be a risk of victimization for someone with PTSD. They're likely to have a similar event happen to them more than once. It's common. People with autism tend to be more naive and they're not reading the patterns and they're not reading the risk factors well. So you can see all of these different like overlaps. There's a lot of overlaps. I'm going to show you now an image of ADHD and autism so you can see the differences with this and the similarities. People with autism like familiarity and routine. The ADHD brain wants new experiences. Now, one of the things, if you're both ADHD and autistic, this can be a huge issue for people who they call themselves ADHD because they have both. There's a part of you that wants the same, like just to be the same. And there's a part of you that's like, this is boring as hell. Like, let's mix it up. And those parts are in conflict. People with autism, again, self-soothe through repetitive behaviors. They have trouble reading social cues intuitively. They're more likely to want routines and they're very strict about their routines. Whereas people with ADHD have trouble with focus, with their attention. People with autism don't usually have that problem. They may have difficulty reading social cues, but only because they're not paying attention. It has nothing to do with an inherent inability to read those cues. If they're able to focus, they can read them very well. But when they struggle to focus, it's harder. And ADHD brains have more trouble with impulsiveness, hyperactivity, and they have trouble stopping themselves. So they're blurting things out. They're interrupting a lot. They're being a little wild with their bodies, or childlike, I guess, in some ways. Makes me think of Jake. But you can see in the middle here are all the overlaps. There's a ton of overlaps. There's stimming. Both people with ADHD and autism stim. They often have repetitive little wiggles and things that they do with their bodies. Sensory issues. So being overstimulated by music or sound, and different kinds of fabrics, interoception issues. So having trouble knowing when you're full, having trouble knowing when you're sleepy. Not be like Jake. I know Jake struggles with this. He never knows when he's sleepy. He just basically goes until he falls down sleeping. Impulse control can be part for both. Both ADHD and autism have what's called an interest-based nervous system. So they're not interested typically in a wide variety of things at once, but usually one thing. And there's a word for that called monotropism. Meaning you're interested in this one thing, very deeply interested in it, though, not superficially interested. And then that thing will change at some point, and you'll become monotropically, if that's the right way to say it, interested in a new thing. There can be emotional regulation difficulties with both. So you get very, very, very sad, very, very, very happy, very, very, very angry, and have trouble coming out of that. It says here, higher rates of substance abuse. There's one, I read one research study that said over 60% of people in AA have autism. That's a crazy amount of people. That's just the people that have been diagnosed. That's intense. And I would be surprised if the remainder are not in some other way, maybe either from PTSD or from their brain patterning. Because when you have a brain that's different, that is stressed, you look for something to soothe it. You're seeking a substance or an activity that's going to calm down your nervous system or regulate it in some way. I think I told you this. The expected lifespan for someone with autism is something like 36 or 36 years or something crazy like that.
Mm.
I'll get back to the viewers on that. I'll put it in the show notes, but I think it's 36 years old because they take themselves out. Yeah, eating disorders are more common, bipolar, OCD, anxiety, etc. Hagen's trying to get in here. Another thing that's shared between ADHD and autism is certain communication patterns like info dumping, oversharing, things like that. But also good things like similar values, the ability to make connections between ideas that other people wouldn't make, extreme creativity. So these are all the negative things, supposedly. But I want to add in a few positive, like there's plenty of positive things. Each one of these looks like a negative, but actually is positive as well. Like craving familiarity and routine. Maybe that makes you feel like you're rigid or stuck, but like you have the capacity to self-soothe. That's good. Build yourself a routine. That's a positive thing. Executive functioning difficulties means when you're trying to plan something, you have a hard time ordering the steps or even imagining where to start. I don't even know where to start. I have all these things that I have to do and I don't know where to start. That's an example of executive functioning. Rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria. That is when there's a risk of rejection, there is an extreme reaction to that. Not like, I mean, nobody likes to be rejected, but we all know people who are like, shrug, okay, they don't like me. And then there are the people who go into like potentially years of sadness and loss over losing a friend. So anyway, I won't go through each one of these, but there's lots of overlap between ADHD and autism. I think that's it.
So if you go back to the PTSD
sure
and autism slide, so to connect to what we were saying earlier, right, when we're exploring how we might be impacted by either autism or ADHD, we look at characteristics or distinguishing features like this. And so on this chart here, on this graph, the PTSD side, to reference our earlier conversation, is going to be more of the nurture / psychology side of the equation, right? And the purely autism side is going to be more of the nature or biology side. And then in the middle, there's all of these things that we can be experiencing and that people come to us complaining about, that if you're watching this, you might recognize a lot of these things within yourself that you've struggled with. And what do you do with that, right? Well, the whole point of what this graphic is showing us here is that at first glance, we can't tell which side of the coin a particular life difficulty or symptom, so to speak, belongs to. And so the work is in doing the self-exploration and whatever forms of healing work resonate with you. As everybody knows, we've got the approaches that we use and like for ourselves and our clients. There's lots of ways to do it, but there has to be some way of exploring this entire middle column and working with each one to determine, is this part of my wiring? Is this part of my nature and my biology, and something that I'm simply going to have to learn how to live with, find coping strategies, find compensatory mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera? Or is there something I can do about this so that this changes? Right. And that's the work. And, for us, for me, it's really easy to say, well, do some trauma clearing work. If it's based in trauma and you do the trauma clearing work, then that'll go away and you've got your answer. If it's not trauma based,
process of exclusion.
Right. If it's not trauma based, it's if it's actually, and this is the experience of that you were describing of yourself earlier, is that you had this expectation that everything in this middle list that you were experiencing, all of your versions of this, was a part of the nurture equation. It was a part of psychological / trauma features that if you could simply identify them, work with the themes, and do a lot of cellular release therapy, clear the trauma, that they would go away, and they didn't. Some of them didn't, right?
Yeah, a lot
And
of them
so, by definition, what isn't shifting must be a part of your wiring, right? Like there's no trauma clearing I'm going to do that where I'm going to wake up in a woman's body. It's not the nurture side of the equation. It's the nature side of the equation, that I'm in a masculine body, a male body, right? So that's what we have to do with these things, right? And so the danger, coming back to the caveats of where I am with all of this personally, because we're going to just make it all about me, right? Where I am with this, things like impulse control difficulties, for example, which is certainly something that I have struggled with, right? And many people struggle with. The caveat is, don't go lumping this cleanly into one category or the other. It's something that we have to live in the tension of and work with it. And I've done that for years. And this is probably, I just randomly picked this one, but it's a good example for me, because I think that my impulse control has improved tremendously, but it isn't, there's still something there that I have to pay attention to, right? It isn't completely resolved, whatever that might mean. I still have to check in with myself and pay attention to my nervous system, check my motivation, assess the degree of consciousness that's behind a particular decision or movement versus what's my emotional state and how, what else is going on in my life? Is it a stress response? Is there some shadow quality involved here? I still have to pay attention to that with food or alcohol or cigars, whatever. That's pretty much my trifecta.
Jeep accessories.
Yeah, now, yes, now. Right.
Collecting. I mean,
yeah, sure. Exactly. Yeah, I'm not really much of a shopper, but certainly I've had phases that fit some of these descriptions of special interests, right?
Yeah.
And so I think with all of this, my experience is that when we do the exploration, I recognize that there's a very particular, the word that I use is flavor. There's a flavor, there's an energetic quality that's present, that differs whether the thing is coming from sort of an authentic biological nature wiring, or whether it's coming from trauma or shadow complex or whatever. And you can learn to distinguish between the two. But we have to do the exploration, and we don't know. My caveat around this for others, because it's a lot of what I have seen, is that people would take something like impulse control difficulties or difficulty managing intense emotions, and they would just lump them in more of the nature category. Well, this is just how I am, right? Well, I mean, have you gone to therapy? Have you talked to somebody? When did this begin? What were, what were your childhood experiences that might have contributed to this? Have you done that exploration, right?
You know what I'm noticing though?
What are you noticing?
I am noticing, as I'm doing now, I have this lens now, I'm doing a retrospective look at all the people that I've interacted with professionally, and really recognizing how many of them have a neurodivergent brain. It is the vast majority. And what that tells me is that people with neurodivergent brains are inherently drawn to the processes that we have we're offering.
Mm.
They are more drawn to try to understand themselves. And they're more likely to not lean on the nature aspect, but to lean into the nurture and try to, because that's what you have power over, right?
Right.
Like, you don't really have a lot of control about your brain. I mean, most people don't know how to work with coping strategies for the brain. They don't have the expertise to know what that looks like or what you're supposed to do. So the only way to feel empowered is to do all kinds of self-help activities and to engage in a therapeutic process. And that's something I see over and over again as I'm looking through researching, doing my special interest, learning about autism, is that everyone says, I have looked at every system. I've done human design, I've done astrology, I've done dream work, I've done blah, 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 like on and on. And now I understand myself. Now I understand why all of these things are present. And they've gone through processes of being in therapy and like working through emotions and getting better and all of that. So I suspect that it's more likely that people are going to be more like me and have been overly invested in the nurture realm, the psychological realm, just by the sheer desire of wanting to know what the hell's going on with me.
Sure. I think certainly the people who find themselves watching this video, yes, are probably going to fall more into that category.
Or the people who are coming to this awareness late in life. I think there might be people early diagnosed in childhood even that may collapse into, this is just how I am.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Right. I think point being that we have to look at both sides of the coin. Right. The point here is to not make assumptions when we recognize some correlation that we have with these particular features and our life experience. We're not going to know until we've done the exploration.
You know what I would say though? I totally agree with everything you're saying. I would add to that is knowing what I know now and having gone through years of CRT and different therapeutic processes. If I had been aware of autism, or if I had anyone in my life who even knew what the hell that was, that could have helped me give myself appropriate autism coping strategies from the beginning, that would have been really awesome.
Sure.
Like in the beginning, when you don't know whether it's autism or PTSD, and you're having all of these like things in the middle, there are tools for each one of these things. There are coping strategies for all of them, and give yourself the nature version of that until you have weeded out the PTSD. Right?
Sure. Yeah. So again, if I paraphrase, it's you can work from either side of the coin as long as you don't ignore the other side.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You can give yourself the coping strategies with the assumption that that's a part of the self-exploration process. And you even, caught me in my bias because I said, well, look at all of these things in the middle. And the way to figure it out is to do shadow work, do trauma clearing, go to therapy, etc. Basically start from the psychology and nurture side of the equation and then see what's left. But the same thing is true, right? You can do, as you're pointing out, you can do it from the other side too. You can put some coping strategies in place and see how you respond, right? Yeah. And if a coping strategy just helps you seamlessly then integrate into life, wonderful. Great. Right. If the coping strategy is something that always has to be in place and it's always a struggle and it's always an effort and doesn't really seem to be making much of a difference in your life experience, then that's probably information that's useful.
Yeah. Like one easy example on the middle here, there's heightened sensitivities to sensory input. Now, I've worked on that for years to try to understand why I'm so jumpy.
Yeah.
If from the very beginning I had the attitude of, I'm very jumpy, could be autism, could be PTSD, I don't know what it is, let me put some headphones in. Let me focus on my nervous system and make sure it's very, calm it down as much as possible. Let me wear a weighted blanket. And I didn't have the attitude of, well, eventually I'll fix it. So
Right.
let me just put up with it until I fix it. That would have been better. I think that would have been better. I think my stress would have been decreased if I had, had somebody in my sphere say, hey, earplugs work great. Why don't you just pop some earplugs in? It's no big deal. Doesn't
Right.
mean anything about you. You're not a weirdo. Just put the earplugs in. So, alas, I did not have that. But I did have a very good therapist and team to help me look at the nurture side. And I think by the time I found autism as a thing, I had all of that stuff already taken care of. I really understand from the nurture side why I have, for example, negative beliefs of myself and the world. And yet there remain some negative beliefs about the self and the world, despite all the work that I've done with CRT. Every now and then I have a day where I'm like, wow, this world pretty much sucks. Can't believe people are like this. That's just part of my brain. That's part of nature. But I have enough awareness of that to be like, yeah, okay. Maybe you need to eat some food. Maybe have a snack.
maybe I'm not homicidal. Maybe I'm just hungry. Yeah, I've
Or
been
maybe
there.
you just need to put your earplugs in for a little while and calm down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are we missing anything? Is there anything else about this particular graph that you'd like to talk more about? Autism and ADHD.
No, I think the same thing applies.
Well, I think we could talk about it from a Puer Senex split.
Yeah, we mentioned
parallel.
that a little bit. I don't want to dive too deep. I think it's nice to keep this concise relatively.
Okay.
But for those who are interested, Jamie and I have certainly noticed that these traits, ADHD versus autism, seem to map very well onto the Puer Senex tension as well, with ADHD being more on the Puer side and autism being on the Senex side. So just a quick glance here, novelty and new experience. Another word for that is adventure.
Yeah.
Right? Adventure is the realm of the Puer. The Senex doesn't want adventure. The Senex wants to come home every night at the same time, have the same TV show on, sit in the same spot on the couch, dinner's ready, life is predictable,
That
right?
sounds amazing.
Yeah. I've got a good dose of both of those, I think, within me.
I
Let
know.
that balance work.
Same.
So yeah, they tend to map out well.
Yeah.
And there's probably a whole fun exploration we could do on that maybe we'll do at some point. But if you like if folks listening like that archetypal psychology, listen to the Puer Senex podcast, and then and I think it's worth doing. So let me just say that because because the Puer and the Senex is an archetypal psychology framework, the value that I find in that is that we can take our exploration of ADHD and autism, and even the things that seem to be, quote, biological or nature. I think that there's another dimension of work we can then do with that by taking it into this archetypal psychology realm and saying, okay, I'm just going to accept that this is a part of my nature, but my nature is both Puer and Senex. That's the point of that archetypal split. Yeah. And in depth psychology and even in spirituality, you could say that the work is about bringing those two sides of this archetypal split into harmony. bringing them into contact, and allowing them to both coexist, these seeming opposites, allowing them to coexist and both have an equal degree of influence over our life, over our psychology, and I would argue over our biology as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, there's something valuable to explore there. When I look and through the exploration we've done, say, well, there's a bunch of ADHD traits that do apply to me, and a couple autistic ones as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done tons of work around them, and they're still there. They still live within me. Well, great. Now what do I do? Well, I can learn some coping strategies.
Mm-hmm.
I can orient my life to accommodate those things in some way, right? Like the job that I choose, the partner that I choose, where I live, right? There's nothing wrong with that. You can do all of those things. And you can take those things up into the archetypal dimension and look at how they map onto the Puer and Senex, and have a whole additional realm of things to work with within yourself, and to explore that can help some of these even nature qualities begin to shift a little bit. Because again, the point is that Puer and Senex describes the two sides of our nature.
Mm-hmm.
So even something from the ADHD or autism spectrum that looks like, well, this is just my nature, fine. But there is another side of our nature as well. And if we explore that, then I think we'll find even some of these more hardwired biological traits have a little bit more malleability to them than perhaps we thought.
Yeah, and I think they do just by becoming conscious of them.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would add is when I'm working with people, there are going to be some people who are ready for or interested in engaging in these two sides from a purely psychological aspect. And I'm going to tell them about the Puer-Senex split.
Sure.
I'm going to talk to them about that. But other people, they need to be they need to come down to earth. They need to be thinking practically about themselves and giving themselves practical tools for coping. And I might talk about ADHD and autism for those folks, because that's going to give them more of what they need, which is actionable steps to feel better. The Puer-Senex has different actionable steps than I argue anyway, that the things that I did to engage with the Puer-Senex, those steps were different than how I interact with autism and ADHD stuff.
Right.
They're more thought-based. They're more maybe active imagination, things like that. Whereas I'm not going to do active imagination necessarily with my autistic inner self.
Right.
I'm going to put the earplugs in.
Yeah, I guess if I can, because I was sort of fleshing that out as I went, I guess if I can summarize what I think is the important point from a personal perspective, there are things that I have found are simply a part of my nature. Mm-hmm. I've done all the trauma work. I've done all the clearing, all of the introspection, tons of shadow stuff, etc. Right, and they're part of my nature, and I there's a lot that I have gained by simply honoring that and letting that be a part of who I am and how I express, right? And accommodating where needed. Mm-hmm. But just because I've recognized that it's a part of my nature, I still don't just stop there. I don't say, well, that's it. I figured it out. This is set in stone. Nothing to do about this. So I'll just do the best I can. I mean, there's some of that, yes, but I don't stop there. I take that into this archetypal understanding of this tension between the Puer and the Senex. And so for me, case in point, as you've pointed out, I tend to have things more from the ADHD spectrum that show up, right? And that happens to coincide with a lot of Puer qualities. And so even though I've recognized a lot of those ADHD symptoms, shall we say, as a part of my nature, I still say, okay, I'm going to elevate this idea and explore the other side of my nature and recognize that, yes, it's a part of my nature and it looks really Puer dominant. So I'm going to see where I can invoke some influence from the Senex archetype in my life and see if that doesn't, in fact, change my nature.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, we've seen that in our relationship.
We have, yes.
If you're the ADHD Puer person and I'm the autistic Senex person, just the fact that we interact with one another and live together and allow each other to influence us has an impact on us. We have changed.
Yep.
I have learned to be a little less rigid. You have learned to be a little bit more rigid. Mm-hmm. Things like that. Yeah. Very cool.
Okay.
Thank you. I think that's enough for now.
That is enough.
Hopefully that helps.
Yes. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.